Hi, I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast. Today we're going to be discussing one of the darker aspects of the hidden history of business. We're talking about organized crime and the mafia. Specifically, we're going to talk about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, for all those who are tired of the romance this weekend. But before we get started, I want to clarify what we mean when we use those words organized crime and mafia, because they've really been muddied over the years, and a lot of people have associations or racial connotations with them that just are not accurate. So first, when we talk about organized crime, the official definition of that is that it is a category of transnational, national, or local groupings of highly centralized enterprises or organizations run by criminals who intend to engage in illegal activity, most commonly for money and profit. And some of these criminal organizations, they can vary from gangs in localized neighborhoods. They could be international organizations. They could be terrorist groups. It could be as simple as simply people who are trying to extort shopkeepers for protection money. There's some debate about whether or not terrorist groups fit into that because they're politically motivated, not necessarily motivated by money or profit. However, most terrorist groups are funded in some way by organized crime. When we say mafia, a mafia is a specific subset of organized crime. It's a type of organized crime syndicate whose primary activities are protection racketeering, arbitrating disputes between criminals, and the organizing and oversight of illegal agreements and transactions. Their secondary activities could be things like gambling, loan sharking, drug trafficking, and fraud. They can also include human trafficking. While the term originally was used with the Sicilian mafias in New York, it has expanded to encompass any organization that uses those methods and purposes, which is why you hear about the Russian mafia, the Japanese mafia. And they tend to have these ethnic terms associated with them, but it's really important to recognize that this mafia behavior is not tied to a specific ethnicity or nationality. It's simply a description of behavior that has been used over and over again by criminal organizations throughout history.
And we do mean throughout history.
All of history. All right, now, Frank, you were going to talk specifically about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Well, in 1929, Al Capone had a little problem. It was George Bugs Moran.
Al Capone, we're talking in Chicago. You have Al Capone and Bugs Moran, who run these two rival groups.
Right. The Chicago outfit was Al Capone's group, and you had the North Side Gang, which was Moran's group. And Bugs lately had been very successful at muscling in on Al Capone's territory. He had been taking over saloons. He had been muscling in on his bootlegging.
His dog racing track.
Oh, his dog racing track. Al Capone had to respond. If not, he was going to be out of business. So what Al Capone did is he plotted to take out Bugs. And he was going to do that because he knew that Bugs had a central location where his gang hung out, and it was a garage or warehouse at 2122 North Clark Street in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. And the building still exists. One day, on Valentine's Day, 1929, two policemen armed with shotguns show up at the garage, and the 7 of Bugs' guys are there, and they're told to line up against the wall. Thinking that was just a regular police shakedown, come in, the police look around, you give them some money, they leave. At that point, 2 men in business suits walk in with Tommy guns, the Thompson machine gun, and proceed to shoot all 7, one of which had 14 bullet wounds. That was Frank Gussenberg, who actually survived the shooting for a few hours, and his last words were the immortal, "I ain't saying anything." The 2 men in business suits then handed the Tommy guns to the police officers. The police officers then escorted the 2 business-looking men out with their hands up in the air, put them in a car, and drove off to the cheers of the witnesses that saw all this.
So if they think that the perpetrators have been captured, the police are involved, everything can continue as normal.
Isn't it great? Except they weren't police officers. They were 2 of Al Capone's men. And even though the police later on found the getaway car, and they eventually found the Thompson machine guns, no one was ever convicted of the crime. Everyone knew that Al Capone's men had done it, but no one was convicted because of witness intimidation and a code of silence among all the criminals. So what happened? What was the result of all this? Well, if we go back just a little bit, what you see is that what they were doing was kind of typical. Bugs had killed a couple of Al Capone's guys. And so Al Capone was just returning the favor. And that was sort of an accepted way of doing business in that era. And in fact, if you go back in history, that's always the way. You kill one of my men, I'm going to kill one of your men. And it goes back and forth. But this time, you had another element. Everyone knew that Al Capone was also tied to business and to politics. For example, Chicago had more than one newspaper. They had newspaper wars.
Oh, yes.
Great example is Hearst, basically fomenting the Spanish-American War to drive up circulation.
Yep.
Well, Al Capone helped one of the local papers gain readers by discouraging their competition. He helped the mayor, Thompson, get elected by discouraging people voting for his opponent. He had a member of his gang who went out and actually blew up some of the polling spots. Now, we see that today in third world countries. It happened here in America.
This is a consistent tactic that intimidation, threats, and force are used over and over again throughout history as this sometimes very quiet, but sometimes very obvious way of helping people gain money, profit, and power.
And Al Capone also gave money, like $250,000.
Because he had the money. Now, where did he get all of his money?
Well, he got his money from, first of all, it was Prohibition. He was running alcohol into Chicago.
Saloons, bootlegging, transport, controlling all of that, and everything that went with that socially.
Yes. If there was any gambling going on, he was getting a cut. You know, the numbers racket, racetrack, and everything else. All those were sources of income for Al Capone.
And then there was the protection and insurance racket.
Very much so.
Which was where you go to, especially very large business owners, and you say, hey, if you will pay me, I'll be on your side. If you don't, I will work for your competitor, or I will physically harm your business.
That's right. And then last, there was the human trafficking. Brothels, the sex trade, all sorts of things were going on like that. So Al Capone basically felt safe. He had the politicians in his pocket. He had the newspapers in his pocket. But the one thing he didn't have in his pocket were the citizens.
But he had before. Previous to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, he was touted frequently by the press that he helped as the Robin Hood of the 1930s.
Well, he'd go to ball games, and he'd be cheered by the crowd. Because everyone thought that he was this good guy because he donated to charities, to the local swimming pools, kept them open, and everything else.
And we should emphasize he was pretty young at this point in time and very charismatic. He was only in his late 20s during the height of his power.
That's right. In fact, in 1929, I think he was 30. He was born in 1899.
Yeah,
so he was 30 years old.
He was very young, and when you look at the pictures, he dressed very nicely. He had these dark brows and this really intense stare that was considered incredibly attractive. He was charismatic, he was charming, he was a great dresser, and people loved him until
the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
And then it all changed. Suddenly he went from being Robin Hood to being public enemy number one.
In fact, that's how the newspapers identified him. And what's more, citizens who had money, who were the socially connected ones, said, hey, this is bad for Chicago. This is bad for our image. This is bad for our business. In addition, the federal government waking up and saying, hey, we need to do something about this. So Eliot Ness, the untouchables, they come in, they bust up the alcohol. They raid the saloons. They raid the brothels. They're giving Al Capone a terrible time. They're having the gunfights and everything else. That was just a diversion.
This was kind of a very obvious PR move by the federal government to have this team, this special team that went out and raided these places and this public figure in Eliot Ness.
Well, a little bit more than that. Because you got to realize that the FBI, which what they were part of, had an image problem at this point. Most people thought the FBI wasn't doing much of anything, and so this gave an opportunity for them to score some public points. But what the government sent in to do the real work were auditors and lawyers.
So they wanted all of the bootleggers and the organized crime focusing on the obvious raids.
Yes.
And not on the devil being in the details.
That's right, because that's exactly what happened. So the auditors and the lawyers go in, and Al Capone's lawyer makes a fatal mistake. He gives the federal government a letter stating that Al Capone made $100,000 one year and that he would be willing to pay the taxes on that. The federal government uses that as evidence in the trial to convict Al Capone of tax evasion.
His illegal income was taxable. They couldn't convict him of tax evasion until they could prove his income. Well, his lawyer had just proven his income. So It didn't matter that he was admitting, hey, we made this and we're willing to pay the taxes. The lawyer had just given a sworn statement to the government saying, my client made this much money and didn't pay on it.
Well, the government had a problem. They could show that Al Capone had spent a lot of money. But spending a lot of money was not a crime. Making a lot of money and not paying taxes on it was the crime.
Mm-hmm. And they didn't have to investigate that. The lawyer just walked in and handed it to them.
Yes. So Al Capone ends up being convicted of tax evasion and the Volstead Act.
They were able to tack on a few of these charges. Volstead Act was the act that instituted prohibition. And they couldn't convict him just on those alone, but they could tack those on with the income that he'd made because he couldn't prove where it came from. And so they could connect the dots.
And that's what they did. So
Wow.
Al Capone ends up being sentenced to 11 years in prison. And there'll be a picture on our website showing the cell that he had in Philadelphia, because that's where he was first incarcerated. Got nice lamps, a nice bed, nice furniture. And one of his gang members was also in prison with him. And Al Capone was showing signs at this time of dementia from syphilis and gonorrhea. And he really couldn't take care of himself very well. And so this other gang member started protecting him. And then the federal officials said, hey, we got to get him out of here where he doesn't have his gang with him. So they sent him to Alcatraz. He spent 8 years in prison total until he was paroled. And at that time, he was basically an invalid and just out of his mind.
Mm-hmm. He'd spent his time in prison making shoes. According to the accounts of the time, he was able to perform that job for 8 hours every day. But when you go to actually read the letters that he was writing during that time, they were becoming pretty unintelligible.
They were. And in fact, he spent the last year or so basically in the prison hospital. So he's released. He goes down to a mansion that he owns in Florida, and that's where he dies shortly thereafter.
He was actually examined by a psychiatrist who said that he was maybe at the mental level of a 12-year-old by that point in time. Which is, I mean, it's a horribly tragic story of someone. And the real tragedy isn't necessarily what happened to Capone. It's what happened to the city while he was in control of it, and to the people whose lives got pulled into this organized crime. But then organized crime kind of went under the radar.
Well, it did.
After
because
Capone was
one of the
incarcerated.
things Al Capone demonstrated was that you don't want to stick out. You don't want to be noticed. You don't stick out. Keep under the radar. You keep doing what you've been doing. So to this day, if you go up to 100 people and ask them, does Al Capone's outfit still exist? I'd tell you probably no. And none of them would be able to tell you who actually is the head of it.
But the Chicago outfit is still active.
Yes.
And a simple Google search will tell you who the current suspected head of it is. I mean, there's still same activities. Sometimes they've innovated and found new markets, but they're still there. And so are other outfits as well. They've just gone under the radar, and they found more sophisticated and more subtle ways of controlling things. But it all goes back still to that money and power.
Yes. And it also goes back. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was brilliant in its execution, but they missed the target. Bugs Moran was the target, not his men, but Bugs.
They think that they mistook one of the men who was there who had a similar height and build for Bugs Moran, but they didn't even get him.
No, they didn't. Even though they had a room across the street watching the garage so they can get Bugs. And he was supposed to be there, but he wasn't. So
all that trouble, and they still didn't even accomplish their goal.
They didn't. In fact, they made it worse because Bugs now knew that he had a very deadly enemy in Al Capone. There's nothing, no holds barred, we're going to get him. Although the feds got him instead. Then you have the idea that you use these appearances. There is a great quote from Sir Arthur Doyle that says there's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. You obviously have policemen hauling the guilty party off to jail, but they weren't. And then last but not least, you have the cover-up, which goes back to some very simple rules. And now, out in the West, and we don't condone this, but there's a saying that regards wolves. And it's called the 3 S's. You shoot it, you shovel it, you shut up. The gangs knew how to shut up. And that's why they got away with it.
And also we see this over and over again in business and in politics, that someone will they'll get power, they'll be successful, they win public support either through manipulating the press or partnerships or simply being really good at manipulating a public image. But then they go too far. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre used the same skill set that made Al Capone so popular. It used manipulating public perception, trust of legitimate sources like the police and the newspapers. It used silence and intimidation. But because of a few fatal flaws, because of how he structured it, he went too far. He assumed the same things would still work, and it resulted in catastrophe. The newspaper stopped supporting him. The same newspapers that built his image turned and created this public enemy number one image. And he lost everything that he had very ill gained. No one is immune from that.
No. And you see this happen over and over again. For a classic example that's recent, somewhat recent, is Enron.
Yes.
They were doing something which was illegal, at least dishonest, and eventually it came out. And when it did, it drove them down.
There are very few scams or criminal acts that can actually continue in the long term if enough checks and balances are in place. But it's also important for us to realize that the public supported Al Capone. Yes. They supported people who were committing these horrific crimes because they looked like a good businessman. And in fact, we were just talking with a client recently where they're right now dealing with a pretty significant crisis where someone who everyone trusted very much, who was doing all this philanthropy, who was volunteering their services for this nonprofit, it turned out that they'd been stealing money from the nonprofit for a very long time. And no one noticed because they trusted them so much. They gave them access to their accounts and didn't require 2 signatures.
That's the classic rule of the con. Mm-hmm. You look normal, but he looked so sweet. He looks so nice.
Well, but that's the root of the word. Con man actually means confidence man.
Yes.
That it's based on the idea that they win your confidence. Mm-hmm. So we can look at folks like Al Capone as these aberrations, these criminals who were wildly successful and then collapsed quickly. However, they're using the exact same tactics everyone else did. And just like the fellow who is embezzling from his employer can be found out, the same rules apply to these big folks. But we need to recognize that we are supporting them and be a little more careful about what that public image is. Because if we've linked our wagons to these unethical people in business who manipulate public image, who are doing things under the table, if we don't put checks and balances in place, the same thing that happened with Al Capone throughout history will happen again to the people we've linked ourselves to.
And you see that going all the way back to the late Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. Nations being violent, using violence to enforce their will. Eventually they fall. And when they do, those who were allied with them pay the penalty as well. But now you take a look at who else looks like Al Capone. Well, nowadays, it's the cartels south of the border. Mm-hmm. You have actually an entire portion of the entertainment industry, which is all geared towards doing biopics and sensational documentaries about the cartel leaders.
Mm-hmm. And about the investigations towards them. Like on Netflix, you have Narcos. We've just seen a huge interview with El Chapo in the press, which, again, entertainers were involved with. Sean Penn and a prominent actress in South America. We are seeing the exact same business dynamics that made Al Capone so popular. The newspaper, the press profiting from this amazing image, the business involvements, the entertainment aspect, those are all coming out yet again with yet another way of making money off of organized crime.
That's right.
And so as you're seeing some of these sensationalized media portrayals of what is essentially organized crime, people who are using intimidation, threats, violence to exploit others for profit and money, be a little thoughtful about that and think about the entire history that is going behind that. Think about folks like Al Capone and the damage that they actually wrought. And really think, are we watching the modern day equivalent of that sensationalized journalism that made these people popular and let them hurt people? That's our little preach for the day.
This is Frank Hutchison.
I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley, and thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find Snark, updates, and behind-the-scenes peeks at production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.